This lesson is an introduction to two basic elements of classical drawing, the envelope and the block-in. To work on these elements, we'll be drawing a simple still life of pears. For this still life, I've set up 3 pairs. It would be best if you could set up your own still life of pears, preferably near a window or a bright light. And if you can, have them so you're looking kind of straight at them, so at your eye level, so you're not looking down on them. But if that's not possible, or you just don't want to, you can definitely draw my pears. For this lesson, you'll need your sketch paper. This is 18 by 24 inch sketch paper. You will need a charcoal pencil, a 2H extra hard. You could also use an HB. A charcoal stick. This is Nitram B. You could also use an HB. And you'll need your kneaded eraser. We're going to begin with the envelope. The envelope is a contour line drawing of the outside of my still life. So I think of, in this case, I think of the main body of the pears. I'm not going to worry about the stems. It gives me a guideline in which to draw. So I can decide how tall I want my pears to be and how wide I think they are. I start with the baseline of the pears, thinking about how wide I want the drawing to be, essentially. And then I create a contoured line drawing with straight lines up the side of the still life, so up the side of these pears. Deciding how tall I think I want them to be. This is the top of the first pear. And then I think about where the second pear is in space, the top, without the stem again. And then where the third one I think is. Down the neck of that third pear, bump out for its body, and then down to that baseline. This is not a perfect drawing. I'm not worried about it being accurate. We might ignore this envelope as we draw, but it gives us a beginning, a starting point. Now we're moving on to the block-in, and I'm going to do a block-in of each of the 3 pairs. And the block-in, we're going to be still using straight lines, but we're going to be drawing the shapes of each of our objects. And essentially, because I have this envelope, I'm going to sort of follow it at first here. I'm thinking about the angle of the neck, in this case of the pear. This is going to still be a little rough. We'll be refining it after we get them all the 3 of the pairs in. The block-in lets you create a scaffold from which to draw each object. So there's our first pair. The second pair, I'm going to begin at the easiest point to find the second pair, which is where those 2 pairs touch. I'm going to compare this part of the pear, the belly of it, with the second pair as I create this block-in. I'm going to compare the heights of these 2 pairs. Number 2 pair is a little bit shorter. So now I have 2 pairs. For my third pair, I'm going to look at the distance from this second pair to the third pair. And I can already see that my envelope is too small, because if I were to draw the third pair in here, I can see there would be no space left. So I'm going to visually measure this part of the second pair to the same part of the third pair. To me, this is an easier space to find than the long distance between the necks. And I'm going to just put a mark in and begin the drawing where I think that pair sits in space. I'm going to ignore this part of the envelope, the right side of the envelope, as I draw this. So there are 3 pairs. Next, we're going to refine them and make the block-in a little more accurate. So now we're going to refine the block-in. I've switched tools. I'm going to use a General's charcoal pencil, and we're going to work with each pair individually. The refining of the block-in involves looking at all of the angles, the width of each object, the size of each object, if there are bumps, if there are interesting contours, but we're still just looking at the outside of each of these objects. I'm staying with straight lines. Try to draw the angles you see. For instance, think about how much the necks of the pairs are tipped to the right or to the left, and try to draw that. Really concentrate on that and try to sort of mimic that. Now I'm moving on to the second pair. I'm going to compare the size I've made here to the size I've made here. I'm going to adjust the block in a little bit here to make the second pair a bit wider. Now I'm going to move to the third pair. Again, thinking about this, and I think I have them a little too close, so I'm going to bring this over a little bit here. As you work, compare your drawing of the pair with the real-life pair, and think about whether they look and feel similar. This block-in is your scaffold, and everything else you do in your drawing will be built on top of it. I want you to keep adjusting the block-in until you're happy with it. So there we have our 3 pairs. I'm going to erase the envelope just so that it's not distracting. But you see, we just use it as a guide. I didn't stay in it when I knew that the pairs were going to be larger than the envelope itself. I'm going to add the stems now. So I'm looking at the shape and size of the stems and where they attach or seem to come out of the pear. I'm doing them the same way I did the blocking of the pears. To determine the length of the stem here, I'm comparing where it ends to where the side of the pear is, as though there was a kind of a guideline here. I'm also thinking about how high it is compared to this stem. I'm thinking about how much space there is from the side to the stem. And you can see I'm constantly adjusting. I'm moving this over bit by bit until I feel like it's in the right place. The third pear's stem moves drastically to the right. And I'm going to think about how far it goes by comparing it to the body of this pear, of its own pear. So I'm finding a place on the side of the pear where I can create a straight line from where I think the pear stem ends to a bump or some interesting bit on this pear that I can create a guideline. Then I look to see if this feels and looks as long as the pear I'm drawing from looks and feels. At first, this is not going to feel easy. Practice doing just this much of the block-in for a while. You'll get better at observing and doing the block-in pretty quickly if you practice. Next, we're going to find the form shadow. And the form shadow is the shadow that is on the subject. So the shadow that's created from the light hitting the subject and the shadow on itself. And I'm going to create that by finding the terminator line, which is the place where the light and the dark meet. And it sort of runs down the object and follows the form of the object. And I'm trying to find where that is most prominent on each of these objects. Essentially, all I'm doing is drawing a line that indicates the area where I see the dark and the light areas meet. Everyone sees this differently. So draw the line where you see the light and the dark transition most prominently. Finding this can be difficult until you get used to it and practice. I squint my eyes to create more contrast between the light and the dark. I'm going to go back to this charcoal stick now and fill in the form shadow, just so we can see that shadow and how it starts to create the three-dimensional form. This shadow is what really starts to create the three-dimensionality of the object. You can see that I am not concerned with perfect shading here. The goal for this part of the lesson is to see and understand the shadows, not to worry about toning them or shading them. We'll be working more on your shading skills in lesson 2. Now for the cast shadows. And the cast shadows are just that, the shadows that are cast onto the tabletop or onto other objects from the light hitting the objects. So where the pears sit on the table, they're casting shadows. I'm just going to block those in. The same way. I'm looking at how they interact with each other. So I'm going to go ahead and tone this in just a bit. Now I'm going to switch tools again to the charcoal pencil, and I'm going to create the cast shadows on the forms. So this pear has a shadow from pear number 1. And this has a shadow from pear number 2. I'm going to fill those in just lightly. Now I'm going to think a little bit about how these two shadows interact. And I feel as though they combine a bit, so I'm going to just add that information there. Everyone is going to see and interpret the shadow shapes differently. Some of you will see more shadow than I'm drawing, some of you are going to see less. So try to draw the shadows as you see them. Now I'm going to refine the shadows just a little, looking at where they're the darkest. Doing this is going to give the shadows a little more definition and to make your pears look a little more three-dimensional. But the purpose of having you do this is that I really want you to look at your objects and observe the shadows and get used to really looking for these kinds of details. That said, don't really worry too much about this. We work a lot on shadows and defining the shadows in lesson 2. Where the objects sit on the tabletop, they're very dark. So I'm going to put that kind of information in to make them feel like they're sitting down on the tabletop. Don't worry about being perfect with this. Your goal is to find the shapes of these objects using the envelope, then the Blockin, and then finding the form shadows on the objects and the cast shadows. It's really an exercise in really starting to see the outside edges, the shapes, the shadows, and to interpret what you're seeing and to get that onto your paper.